I'm Kate Schreckenberg, and I'm a professor in environment and development in the Department of Geography at King's. And currently, I'm also the head of department of the Department of Geography. That's a 4-year role, so I'm just halfway through that. I got into thinking about how people and the environment interact with each other already very early on, when I had the wild ambition of wanting to solve the world's food security problem. And I guess the reason I was so concerned about that was actually my family history, and that my father was an agricultural economist who worked for the United Nations, and he worked in lots of different countries around the world. And so as a child, I used to visit him in all these different countries. So I was exposed from a very early age to farmers in many different parts of the world, and also to the problems of hunger in many parts of the world. And so I did a botany degree, thinking that you had to produce more food to feed the world's population. And during my university career, as one does, you learn that you've set out with completely the wrong ideas. and I realised it wasn't about producing more food, but producing it differently, distributing it properly, and reducing waste, giving people access to food rather than producing more. After I did my master's, which was in forestry and land use, I had the opportunity to be an intern. It was almost a year's worth of work for the German Sahelian program in Burkina Faso. It was the first time that I'd used remote sensing. At that time, it wasn't the remote sensing that it is today, which uses satellite images, but we were using aerial photographs, and we were taking them to communities and using those photographs to map out where the different land uses were, and who was using what piece of land at which time of year, what the sort of conflicts were between different groups, because they had settled farmers and then they had herders there as well, pastoralist groups. So it was fascinating understanding, sharing one type of knowledge and getting their knowledge back, and engaging together with this land use planning exercise. And I think what I learned from that was that there's an awful lot of complexity at local level, that different groups of people are using the same areas of land at different times of year, negotiating quite carefully about who uses it when. So the farmers, for example, have their crops. Then when their crops are harvested, the cattle herders come in, the cattle eat the crop residue and also provide manure for the field. So that sounds like a really good reciprocal relationship, but it can get a bit fraught at times if the cattle come in too early, for example. So it was really interesting to find out about how people were negotiating this land use in a very complex environment. And that took me on then to want to be a bit more expert in that area and do more work in how people and environment work together in different environments. So my internship was in the savannah environment in Burkina Faso. I then had the opportunity to go and work on tropical forests, working at UNESCO in the Man and Biosphere program. And then after that, I did my PhD, which was back in West Africa in Benin. And my PhD was on non-timber forest products, which is basically nuts, fruits, anything that's not timber that you get from trees and from a forest environment. One of my early research interests, after having done my PhD looking at these non-timber forest products, I was really interested in how communities together manage their resources. So I got into studying community forestry. It was also a time when there was a lot of interest and funding for work on community forestry. I did work in quite a lot of different countries around the world looking at how people manage their forests. And I began to realize as I did it that when you really dug deep, it was very complicated for local people. There was a lot of negotiation going on. There was a lot of elite capture. So that's people within a community who have more power than others and who are able to manage or arrange for the forest to be managed in such a way that the products that they want are produced and they get more money out of it. It was very clear that women and men have very different abilities to voice their sort of aspirations for how they want to use an area of land, like a forest, for example. And often it was men taking decisions and women doing a lot of the labour, doing the tree planting, doing the maintenance of trees, and so on. I began to see that there was a lot of inequity, sometimes injustice at the local level within communities, and understanding that communities are not just a homogeneous block, but there's lots of different groups within that, just as there are within countries and between countries as well. That was an important insight for me, and it kind of got me into doing more work on environmental justice and social justice, and thinking about how do we manage any natural resource, not just forests, but any natural resource in a way that is fair to everybody. There were, I think, 3 things that brought me to King's. One was the geography department itself, and it's a very large geography department and it's very interdisciplinary, and I was really interested in that because I'd been in a quite small environmental sciences department before, which I loved, but I really needed the challenge of having a group of people where there were really good physical geographers who could challenge me on the sort of biophysical aspects of the work I do. So looking at nature and people, you've got to understand the nature side, the cycles of trees and environment that's going on. But you also need the experts on the human geography side who really understand why people do things they do. And so having a really large number of people in a department who engage across those different fields, for me, was just wonderful. My research focus right now is probably partly determined by my PhD students, to be honest. You get to a point in your career, especially when you're doing a lot of admin roles, where it's quite hard to do your own research sometimes. And I'm really fortunate to have a wonderful group of PhD students who are doing research in all sorts of different countries, from Cambodia to India to Ghana and Bolivia and Ireland and Scotland. So I have, the world's my oyster almost, and I do a lot of my sort of thinking through what they're observing on the ground. I'm most challenged by the fact that I am actually a white privileged woman doing research. I certainly didn't think twice about the fact that I was going to go and do research in Benin or any other country in the global south, called developing countries at that time. For me, that felt like a reasonable thing to do. And I always worked with local partners, but I was always the more powerful one, the one that came in with the research money. And over time, that's become a less and less comfortable position to be in. And so now I have to think much harder about how I do the research. And that, I think, is also one of the reasons I like being in academia, and rather than in a research institute. I'm in a place where I can try and work with research students from those countries to do research in their own countries. I get more and more frustrated when I see that we produce lots of research about things that should be happening at the global level, like we should be ending funding for fossil fuels. We should be giving Indigenous people rights to manage their own resources. All of this is, well documented by research, and yet it's not happening because of political will. And I feel like researchers need to start being a bit more active, a bit more ready to speak out at the national and international level to say, we've done the research, listen to the research, and let's start thinking about how we can negotiate between different parties to manage to turn that into something that actually trickles back down to a proper decision on the ground. One of the things I enjoy most about research is the ability to, go out with an interview schedule with a certain set of questions, but then to keep probing. You get answers back and you know that there's actually a little bit more behind that answer, and you've got to keep asking to really find out what's going on and to understand a situation.